Imagine standing on a cold battlefield in medieval Europe. Across the muddy fields, thousands of armored knights lower their lances, certain that victory is only moments away. Their enemy is outnumbered, poorly equipped, and made up of ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and peasants. By every rule of medieval warfare, the battle should already be over. But then something unexpected happens. Wooden wagons roll into position, forming what looks like a moving fortress. Crossbows are loaded. Primitive hand cannons begin to smoke. And somewhere behind those wagons stands a commander who cannot even see the battlefield. He gives the order. Minutes later, one of the most powerful armies in Europe is fleeing in complete chaos. That commander was Jan Žižka. He lost one eye in his youth. Later, he lost the other, becoming completely blind. Yet despite never seeing another battlefield again, he continued leading armies to victory, defeating kings, crusaders, and experienced knights without suffering a single defeat. He transformed ordinary civilians into one of the most feared fighting forces in medieval Europe, pioneered tactics that would influence warfare for centuries, and achieved something almost no military commander in history ever has. He never lost a battle. So why have so few people ever heard his name? This is the extraordinary story of Jan Žižka, the blind general who changed the art of war forever. Chapter 1, A Warrior Before the Legend. To understand Jan Žižka, you first have to understand the world that created him. Europe in the late 14th century was a dangerous place. Kingdoms fought endless wars over land and power. Noble families competed for influence, while ordinary people struggled under heavy taxes, famine, and disease. The Black Death had devastated entire populations only decades earlier, leaving political instability in its wake. In the heart of Central Europe stood the Kingdom of Bohemia, one of the wealthiest and most influential states within the Holy Roman Empire. Its capital, Prague, was a thriving center of commerce, learning, and religion. Magnificent churches rose above crowded marketplaces, while scholars from across Europe filled the halls of Charles University. But beneath this prosperity, tensions were quietly growing. The Catholic Church held enormous political and economic power. Many clergy lived in luxury while ordinary believers faced poverty and hardship. Corruption had become increasingly common, and calls for reform were beginning to spread throughout Bohemia. It was into this uncertain world that Jan Žižka was born around the year 1360. Unlike many famous conquerors, very little is known about his childhood. Historians still debate exactly where he was born and what his early years looked like. There are no detailed chronicles describing his education or upbringing. That mystery only adds to his legend. What is known is that Žižka came from a lower noble family. He wasn't a prince destined to inherit a kingdom, nor was he raised inside a royal court. Instead, he grew up in a society where survival often depended on courage, loyalty, and skill with a weapon. As a young man, he learned the realities of medieval warfare firsthand. Bohemia was surrounded by political rivals, and conflicts between noble families were common. Like many young nobles of his time, Žižka became a professional soldier, fighting wherever opportunity or loyalty demanded. These early campaigns hardened him. Years of combat taught him lessons that few commanders ever truly understood. He witnessed how heavily armored knights dominated battlefields, how discipline often mattered more than bravery, and how a clever commander could defeat a stronger enemy through superior tactics rather than sheer numbers. But one battle would leave a permanent mark on him. Sometime during his early military career, Jan Žižka suffered a devastating injury that destroyed one of his eyes. No one knows exactly how it happened. Some historians believe it occurred during a battle. Others suggest it may have been the result of a tournament or another violent encounter. Whatever the cause, the injury changed his appearance forever. For many soldiers, such a wound would have ended their military career. For Jan Žižka, it became only the beginning. With vision in just one eye, he continued fighting across Central Europe, gaining experience, earning respect, and developing the tactical instincts that would later make him one of history's most extraordinary generals. At the time, however, no one could have imagined what was coming next. Because while Žižka was becoming a seasoned warrior, another man, far away in the city of Prague, was preparing to ignite a revolution that would change Bohemia forever. And when those two stories finally collided, Europe would never be the same. Chapter 2, A Nation on the Brink. While Jan Žižka was forging his reputation as a hardened warrior, Bohemia itself was approaching a breaking point. The greatest threat to the kingdom wasn't a foreign army. It was division from within. At the center of that growing storm stood a university professor and preacher named Jan Hus. Unlike most priests of his time, Hus spoke directly to ordinary people in the Czech language rather than Latin. His sermons filled churches with craftsmen, merchants, and farmers who had grown frustrated with the wealth and corruption they saw within parts of the Catholic Church. Hus did not reject Christianity. He believed the Church had strayed from its own teachings. He openly criticized the sale of indulgences, questioned the growing political power of church leaders, and demanded that the Bible, not wealth or status, should guide Christian life. To many people, he was a voice of hope. To powerful religious authorities, he was becoming dangerously influential. As his popularity spread throughout Bohemia, church officials demanded his silence. Instead, he continued preaching. Eventually, Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance in 1414. He was promised safe passage to defend his beliefs before church leaders. But the promise meant nothing. Almost immediately after arriving, Hus was arrested and imprisoned. For months, he was pressured to abandon his teachings. He refused. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was declared a heretic and burned alive at the stake. His execution shocked Bohemia. News spread rapidly across towns and villages. To many Czechs, Hus had not died as a criminal. He had died as a martyr. Public anger exploded. Protests grew larger. Noble families took sides. Religious tensions mixed with political frustration, creating a crisis unlike anything Bohemia had experienced before. Then, in 1419, everything reached a tipping point. In Prague, an angry crowd of Hussite supporters marched to the new town hall, demanding the release of imprisoned followers. The city officials refused. Moments later, several council members were thrown from the upper windows onto the spears of the waiting crowd below. The event became known as the First Defenestration of Prague. It was more than a riot. It was the beginning of a revolution. Within weeks, King Wenceslas IV died, leaving Bohemia leaderless. His brother, Sigismund, already deeply unpopular among many Czechs and associated with the execution of Jan Hus, claimed the throne. Many refused to recognize him. The kingdom was now divided between those loyal to the Catholic monarchy and those determined to defend the Hussite cause. War had become inevitable. Amid this chaos, one experienced veteran began attracting attention. Jan Žižka. Unlike many noble commanders, he understood that his followers were not professional knights. They were blacksmiths, farmers, miners, craftsmen, men with almost no military training. Most commanders would have seen weakness. Žižka saw opportunity. If his soldiers could never match heavily armored knights in strength, then they would have to defeat them with something even more powerful. Discipline, preparation, and tactics no European army had ever witnessed before. The revolution was no longer simply about religion. It was about survival. And Jan Žižka was about to change the rules of medieval warfare forever. Chapter 3, The General Who Changed Warfare. By the summer of 1420, the Hussites faced an enemy they had little chance of defeating. The Pope had called for a crusade against Bohemia. Thousands of experienced knights from across Europe answered that call. Warriors from Germany, Hungary, Austria, and beyond marched toward Prague, convinced they were about to crush a rebellion of poorly armed peasants. On paper, the outcome seemed inevitable. The Crusaders possessed superior numbers, better armor, experienced cavalry, and generations of military tradition. The Hussites had none of those advantages. What they did have was Jan Žižka. Unlike the commanders of his age, Žižka wasn't interested in fighting by medieval rules. He understood something his enemies did not. The greatest strength of a knight, his devastating cavalry charge, could also become his greatest weakness. So instead of meeting cavalry head-on, Žižka reshaped the battlefield itself. He ordered ordinary farm wagons to be reinforced with thick wooden planks, iron chains, and protective shields. These wagons were linked together into defensive walls that could be assembled within minutes almost anywhere. To the crusaders, they looked like simple supply carts. They were anything but. Behind these mobile fortresses stood crossbowmen, handgunners armed with primitive firearms, pikemen, and soldiers carrying flails, tools once used for farming, now transformed into deadly weapons. The wagons were more than defenses. They were traps. When enemy cavalry charged, they found themselves unable to break through the barricades. Horses panicked. The tightly packed formations lost momentum. Then the Hussites struck. Crossbow bolts rained down. Early firearms filled the air with smoke and thunder. Pikemen attacked exposed riders. As confused knights struggled to regroup, Hussite infantry surged forward with flails, axes, and maces, turning chaos into slaughter. For perhaps the first time in medieval Europe, disciplined infantry had found a reliable way to defeat elite heavy cavalry. Žižka had rewritten the rules of war. His first great test came at the Battle of Sutomir in March 1420. His force numbered only a few hundred men. The enemy outnumbered them several times over. Instead of retreating, Žižka chose the battlefield carefully. He positioned his wagons between two ponds, leaving only a narrow strip of muddy ground for the attackers to cross. The crusader cavalry advanced confidently. But the marshy terrain slowed the horses, breaking their formation before they could even reach the Hussite defenses. Pinned down by crossbow fire and primitive guns, the attackers descended into confusion. When Žižka judged the moment right, he launched a fierce counterattack. The larger army collapsed. It was an astonishing victory. Yet an even greater challenge was already approaching. Later that year, a massive crusading force surrounded Prague itself. Their objective was simple. Capture the city. End the rebellion. Destroy the Hussites forever. One position stood directly in their path. A rocky hill overlooking the capital known as Vitkov Hill. Žižka understood its importance immediately. If the Crusaders seized the hill, Prague would become nearly impossible to defend. With only a few hundred soldiers, he hurried to fortify the position. Day after day, waves of heavily armored Crusaders climbed the steep slopes. Each assault was met by arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, gunfire, and relentless resistance. The defenders refused to give ground. As the attackers became exhausted on the narrow hillside, Žižka recognized the perfect moment. He ordered a sudden counterattack. The Hussites charged downhill with incredible force. Caught off guard and unable to maneuver on the steep terrain, the Crusaders broke ranks. Some fled. Others fell from the rocky slopes below. Within hours, one of the largest crusading armies assembled against Bohemia had been thrown into retreat. News of the victory spread across Europe. Kings and nobles struggled to understand what had happened. How had ordinary farmers defeated Europe's finest knights? The answer wasn't superior weapons. It wasn't larger armies. It was superior leadership. Jan Žižka had proven that discipline, innovation, and intelligent tactics could overcome overwhelming odds. But the greatest challenge of his life still lay ahead. Soon, the general who had already changed medieval warfare would suffer an injury that should have ended his military career forever. Chapter 4, Fighting Without Sight. For most military commanders, losing one eye would have been a lifelong burden. Losing both would have meant the end. For Jan Žižka, it became the beginning of his greatest legend. Around 1421, during one of the relentless campaigns of the Hussite Wars, Žižka suffered another devastating injury. During the siege of Robbie Castle, an arrow, or according to some accounts, a splinter from artillery fire, struck his remaining eye. Within days, he was completely blind. News spread quickly. Surely the Hussite army had lost its greatest commander. Surely the Crusaders would finally have their victory. But they were wrong. Remarkably, Žižka refused to step away from command. Instead of allowing blindness to become his weakness, he adapted. He relied on trusted officers to describe the battlefield in precise detail. Scouts constantly reported the movement of enemy forces. Messengers carried his orders across the front lines with remarkable speed. Years of warfare had given him something eyesight could never replace. He could read a battlefield through experience. He understood terrain. He understood timing. And above all, he understood people. His soldiers trusted him completely. That trust became one of the Hussite army's greatest weapons. Unlike many medieval armies that collapsed when their leader was wounded, the Hussites fought with even greater determination under Žižka's command. They believed they were defending not only their homeland, but also the vision of a commander who had sacrificed everything alongside them. Meanwhile, the Crusaders remained convinced that a blind general could not possibly continue winning battles. Again and again, they attacked. Again and again, they failed. Each defeat became more humiliating than the last. Žižka constantly refined his tactics. Wagon forts became more sophisticated. Infantry moved with remarkable discipline. Early firearms, still rare on European battlefields, were used alongside crossbows, pikes, and war flails in carefully coordinated attacks. His armies rarely relied on brute force. Instead, they relied on preparation. Every hill, river, forest, and narrow road became part of the battle plan. Žižka chose where to fight. He forced his enemies into unfavorable positions. Then he struck at exactly the right moment. It was warfare built on intelligence rather than strength. By now, his reputation had spread far beyond Bohemia. To his followers, he was a symbol of resistance. To his enemies, he had become something far more unsettling. A commander who simply could not be defeated. Every failed crusade strengthened the Hussite cause and weakened the authority of those who had expected an easy victory. Entire armies returned home asking the same impossible question. How could a blind man keep outthinking Europe's greatest military leaders? The answer was surprisingly simple. Jan Žižka no longer relied on his eyes. He relied on discipline, preparation, and an extraordinary understanding of war. By the time he reached the final years of his life, he had achieved something almost unheard of in military history. Despite fighting countless campaigns against larger and better equipped armies, he had never lost a single battle. Yet his greatest campaign would also become his last. Even in death, Jan Žižka's influence would continue shaping the future of Bohemia, and the history of warfare itself. Chapter 5, Legacy of an Unbeaten Commander. In the autumn of 1424, Jan Žižka was preparing for yet another campaign. For years, he had defeated every army sent against him. Crusaders had crossed Europe believing they could crush the Hussites in a single decisive battle, only to return home defeated. Kings had underestimated him. Experienced generals had failed to outmaneuver him. By now, his name alone inspired confidence among his followers and fear among his enemies. But after decades of surviving countless battlefields, it would not be a sword or an arrow that ended his life. During the campaign near the town of Přibyslav, Žižka suddenly fell ill. Most historians believe he died from an infectious disease, likely the plague, although the exact cause remains uncertain. He was around 64 years old. For medieval Europe, that was an extraordinary age for a man who had spent nearly his entire life at war. His death was a devastating blow to the Hussite movement. The army had not simply lost a general. It had lost the man who had united ordinary farmers, miners, craftsmen, and townspeople into one of the most effective fighting forces Europe had ever seen. Yet something remarkable happened. The Hussite army did not collapse. Instead, it continued fighting. The discipline, organization, and tactical principles Žižka had spent years developing had become deeply rooted within his soldiers. His commanders carried forward the methods he had created, and the wagon fort tactics that had shocked Europe continued to bring victories even after his death. For years, the Hussites remained a force that no crusading army could easily defeat. Legends soon began to surround Žižka. One famous story claims that before his death, he asked his soldiers to make a war drum from his skin so that even after he was gone, he could continue terrifying his enemies on the battlefield. There is no historical evidence that this ever happened. But the fact that such a legend endured reveals how larger than life he had become in the minds of his followers. His true legacy, however, was far greater than any myth. Jan Žižka fundamentally changed the way wars were fought. At a time when heavily armored knights dominated Europe, he proved that disciplined infantry, intelligent tactics, and coordinated use of early firearms could overcome even the strongest cavalry. Centuries later, military historians would recognize many of his ideas as being far ahead of their time. His emphasis on mobility, defensive field fortifications, combined arms tactics, and battlefield preparation anticipated concepts that would become standard long after the Middle Ages had ended. More importantly, he demonstrated that victory does not always belong to the larger army. Sometimes, it belongs to the commander who understands the battlefield better than anyone else. Today, Jan Žižka is remembered as a national hero in the Czech Republic. Statues stand in his honor. His victories are studied by military historians around the world. Yet outside Central Europe, surprisingly few people know his name. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. History remembers Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, and Napoleon as some of the greatest military commanders who ever lived. Their achievements deserve that recognition. But Jan Žižka accomplished something almost none of them could claim. He never lost. Not once. He achieved the impossible while fighting with fewer resources, fewer professional soldiers, and eventually, without the ability to see the battlefield itself. So perhaps the real question isn't how a completely blind commander defeated every army sent against him. The real question is, why has one of history's greatest undefeated generals remained hidden from the world for so long?